The justice systems of the ancient and medieval world didn't just punish people. They invented entire genres of chaos. From cursed rituals to humiliating public spectacles, these societies dealt with criminals in ways that make modern law look painfully boring. Today, we're diving into 44 punishments so strange, dramatic, and absurd that you'll swear humanity once hired comedians to write legal codes. 1. Democracy in ancient Athens wasn't just about freedom. It was actually the world's first and pettiest popularity contest aimed at annoying people. This system was called ostracism, and it is proof that the Greeks loved drama more than actual justice. Once a year, citizens could vote to banish any person they just didn't like for 10 years. You didn't have to rob a bank or betray the state to get kicked out. You just had to be that guy who talks too much at parties or flexes his wealth a bit too hard. There is a hilarious story about a politician named Aristides who was voted out simply because a random voter was sick and tired of hearing everyone call him Aristides the Just. Imagine getting exiled from your own country just because you were too much of a goody two-shoes. It was essentially the ancient version of getting voted off the island in a reality show, but the consequences involved actual homelessness instead of a spin-off series. 2. While most cultures put criminals in jail, the Spartans preferred to turn them into walking fashion disasters to shame them into oblivion. If a Spartan soldier showed cowardice in battle, they didn't execute him because that was too easy. Instead, they forced him to walk around with half of his beard shaved off while the other half grew wild. It was the mullet of the ancient world, but significantly more embarrassing. To complete the look, these poor guys known as tremblers were legally required to wear cloaks sewn together from colorful mismatched patches of fabric. They looked like sad military clowns. No one would talk to them, give them fire, or marry their sisters. It was a lifetime of passive-aggressive bullying where the state forced you to cosplay as a hobo, just to remind everyone that you ran away that one time. 3. Ancient China developed a punishment that was basically a portable wooden coffee table locked around your neck. It was called the kange, and while it wasn't lethal, it was designed to be the most annoying inconvenience in human history. The device was a massive square board with a hole in the middle for the criminal's head, and it was so wide that the person couldn't reach their own mouth with their hands. This meant you had to rely on the kindness of strangers or family members to spoon-feed you like a giant, helpless baby in the middle of the street. If nobody liked you, you starved. The authorities would also paste a piece of paper on the board listing your crimes, so you were essentially walking around with a bad Yelp review attached to your face. It turned everyday activities like sleeping or scratching an itchy nose into an impossible yoga challenge. 4. The Romans invented the ultimate form of cancel culture long before Twitter existed, and they called it damnatio memoriae. If an emperor or a high-ranking official really messed up, the Senate wouldn't just kill them. They would legally pretend the guy never existed in the first place. It was the most petty level of ghosting imaginable. They would send workers all over the empire to chisel the guy's name off of stone inscriptions, melt down his coins, and smash his statues. They would even repaint family portraits to blur out his face. It was a massive, expensive temper tantrum designed to delete a human being from history. The irony is that by working so hard to say, "Don't look at this guy," they actually made us more curious about him thousands of years later. It's like telling someone not to think of a pink elephant. The Romans just made the elephant invisible, which is way worse. 5. If you think community service is bad, wait until you hear about the Roman punishment called the furca, which essentially turned you into a farm animal. For minor crimes where execution felt like overkill, the judge would force you to carry a heavy wooden fork, normally used to support wagons, around your neck. You had to walk around your village with this giant V-shaped log pressing down on your shoulders, creating a triangular frame around your head. It wasn't just heavy, it was completely ridiculous looking. You had to parade through the neighborhood while your hands were tied to the ends of the fork, looking like a very confusing piece of agricultural equipment. It was designed to hurt your back, but mostly it was designed to hurt your ego. Your neighbors would point and laugh as you struggled to navigate narrow doorways with your giant wooden necklace, proving that the Romans believed the best rehabilitation was public humiliation. 6. If you think your neighbors are annoying, the Vikings had a way of dealing with disputes that was essentially a weaponized lawn ornament. It was called the nithing pole, and it was the ultimate magical screw you to anyone you hated. A person would take a long wooden pole, carve some rude runes on it, and stick a horse's head on top facing the enemy's house. The idea was to offend the local land spirits so much that they would get angry and drive the victim out of the area. It wasn't a physical attack. It was a supernatural eviction notice. The user of the pole would literally curse the land itself to reject their neighbor. It brings a whole new meaning to curb appeal, proving that the Vikings were just as good at petty drama as they were at raiding. 7. Ancient Roman debt collectors didn't need to break your kneecaps because they had a legal method of harassment called flagellatio. This was basically state-sanctioned bullying. If someone owed you money, you were allowed to dress up in ridiculous, mismatched clothes, stand in front of their house, and just scream at them all day long. You could insult their family, mock their appearance, and make up rhymes about how broke they were. The goal was to be so incredibly annoying and embarrassing that the debtor would pay you just to make the noise stop. It was a public roast that didn't end until the cash was handed over, turning the streets of Rome into a chaotic shouting match of financial shame. 8. In medieval Germany, being a bad musician wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a crime against the community that required the shame flute. If you were caught playing poorly in public or just being a general nuisance with your noise, the authorities would lock an iron flute around your neck. This wasn't a real instrument, but a heavy metal clamp that looked like a flute. Your fingers were clamped to the keys in a fixed position, so you were forced to walk around town looking like you were playing an eternal, silent solo. It was a brilliant way to tell someone they sucked at art without actually saying a word, forcing them to parade their lack of talent in front of everyone who had ears. 9. The ancient Irish had a legal system called Brehon law, which included the most passive-aggressive way to sue someone in human history: the troscud, or fasting against a person. If a guy of high status wronged you, you didn't attack him. You went to his house, sat on his front doorstep, and refused to eat. The social pressure was immense because if you died of starvation on his lawn, his reputation was ruined forever, and he would likely be cursed. It was a high-stakes game of chicken where you guilt-tripped your enemy into justice by weaponizing your own hunger. You were essentially saying, "Look what you are making me do," until the guy got so awkward he finally caved in and paid his debts. 10. While we usually associate the Aztecs with scary rituals, they had a surprisingly chill but weirdly specific rule about alcohol. If you were young and got drunk in public, they would shave your head and beat you, effectively grounding you for life. But here is the kicker. If you were over the age of 70, you could drink as much as you wanted. The Aztecs believed that once you hit 70, your blood was getting cold, so you needed the alcohol to warm you up. It was a state-mandated retirement party that never ended. You would have teenagers getting head shaved for sipping a beer, while Grandpa was legally allowed to be wasted 24/7 because it's for his health. 11. England in the 16th and 17th centuries had a punishment for public drunkenness that looked like a prop from a bad cartoon. It was called the drunkard's cloak, but it was actually just a giant wooden beer barrel. The authorities would knock the bottom out of the barrel and cut a hole in the top for the head and holes in the sides for the arms. The offender had to walk through the city wearing this heavy, wooden tube like a terrible suit of armor. It was impossible to sit down, impossible to scratch your nose, and you looked absolutely ridiculous waddling down the street. It was a literal walk of shame where the punishment perfectly fit the crime. You loved the barrel so much, now you have to live inside it. 12. Ancient India had a concept of purification that makes a juice cleanse look delicious. If you committed a social offense or broke a caste rule, you might be ordered to consume the panchagavya. This was a holy cocktail made from 5 products of the cow: milk, curd, ghee, urine, and dung. Yes, you had to drink a smoothie made of cow poop to get your social standing back. The idea was that the cow is a sacred animal, so everything that comes out of it is purifying, even the waste products. It was a test of faith and a test of your gag reflex. If you could chug this mixture without throwing up, you were considered clean again, though your breath probably suggested otherwise for weeks. 13. In medieval Europe, if a husband and wife were constantly fighting and disturbing the peace, the neighbors would organize a skimmington ride. This was a chaotic parade where the couple, or actors pretending to be them, were forced to ride a donkey backwards through the village. Facing the tail was the ultimate symbol of humiliation and loss of control. The villagers would bang pots and pans, creating rough music to mock the couple's inability to run a happy household. It was basically the entire town coming together to say, "You guys are too loud and your marriage is a joke." It wasn't violent, but being the star of a donkey parade is a memory that definitely ruins your reputation at the local market. 14. You might think the legal system is messy today, but in medieval Europe, they allowed actual farm animals to have defense attorneys. This was the bizarre world of animal trials, where pigs, rats, and even weevils could be charged with crimes like murder or property damage. We are talking about a full courtroom setting, where a lawyer would stand up and argue that his client, a sow, was a good citizen who just had a bad day. If found guilty, the animal could be excommunicated by the church or publicly executed. It sounds like a fever dream, but there are records of village courts spending hours debating whether a swarm of locusts had the legal right to eat a farmer's crop, proving that medieval bureaucracy had absolutely no chill. 15. Before we had lie detector tests, the Anglo-Saxons had something way more carb-heavy called the trial by cake, or corsned. If a priest or high-ranking official was accused of a crime, they had to eat a 1-ounce piece of consecrated barley bread or cheese. The logic was that if they were lying, an angel would cause them to choke on the spot. It was basically a divine swallowing contest. If you managed to get the dry crust down your throat without gagging, you were innocent. If you choked or turned pale, you were guilty. It brings a whole new level of stress to dinner time, suggesting that the ultimate judge of character in ancient England was essentially mild gluten intolerance. 16. Gossiping in medieval Germany wasn't just rude, it was an offense punishable by wearing the Schandmask, or mask of shame. These were heavy, iron masks that looked like terrifying metal cartoons, often featuring long noses, pig snouts, or donkey ears to mock the offender's behavior. If you were caught spreading rumors, the authorities would lock this metal cage onto your head and force you to walk through the town square. Some masks even had a metal tab that went into your mouth to press down your tongue, physically preventing you from speaking. It was a literal "shut up" button that turned the neighborhood busybody into a walking, clanking warning sign for everyone else to mind their own business. 17. Being a single bachelor in ancient Sparta wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was considered a failure of duty to the state. The Spartans were obsessed with making strong babies, so if you stayed single for too long, the government would publicly humiliate you. During the winter, bachelors were forced to walk around the marketplace in nothing but a tunic, or sometimes entirely naked, singing a song about how their punishment was just because they had disobeyed the laws. Imagine having to parade around your local mall in the freezing cold, singing a catchy jingle about what a loser you are for not having a wife. It was state-sponsored bullying designed to annoy you into marriage. 18. Bankruptcy is stressful enough, but in 17th century France, the law required you to become a fashion victim as well. If you declared insolvency, you were forced to wear a bright green cap called the bonnet vert every time you left your house. This wasn't a trendy accessory, it was a public signal to everyone that you were broke and bad with money. If you were caught in public without your green hat, your creditors could legally throw you back in prison. It was a system designed to kill your social life completely, ensuring that every time you walked down the street, people knew exactly why you weren't buying the next round of drinks. 19. The most absurd courtroom drama in history happened in Rome during the Cadaver Synod, where they put a dead guy on trial. Pope Stephen VI hated his predecessor, Pope Formosus, so much that he had the corpse dug up 7 months after burial. They dressed the rotting body in full papal robes, propped him up on a throne, and appointed a deacon to answer for him. The current pope screamed at the corpse, found him guilty, and then cut off his 3 blessing fingers. It was a Weekend at Bernie's style nightmare that proved you weren't even safe from your enemies after you died. The fact that they expected the corpse to defend itself is the kind of madness you just can't make up. 20. In Puritan America and parts of Europe, if you fell asleep during a long, boring church service, the punishment was immediate and embarrassing. Each church had a designated tithing man who carried a long wooden pole. On one end was a hard knob or a heavy metal tip, and on the other was a foxtail or a feather. If a man fell asleep, he got a sharp rap on the head with the hard end. But if a woman fell asleep, the tithing man would tickle her face with the foxtail to wake her up. It was a weirdly specific gendered wake-up call that turned the holy service into a slapstick comedy routine, ensuring that nobody could enjoy a peaceful nap during the sermon. 21. Scottish churches had a device called the jugs, which was basically a heavy iron collar attached to the church wall by a chain. If you were caught swearing, being drunk, or working on the Sabbath, the priest would lock your neck into the collar right at the church entrance. You had to stand there while the entire congregation walked past you to attend the service. It was the ultimate walk of shame because you became the greeter for the Sunday Mass, but instead of handing out pamphlets, you were just standing there looking miserable in a metal necktie. It was a brilliant way to use peer pressure to enforce moral behavior, making sure your hangover was on public display for everyone to judge. 22. We all hate getting ripped off at the grocery store, but in medieval France, the customer service policy for dishonest shopkeepers was delightfully sticky. If a merchant was caught selling rotten butter, the authorities didn't just fine him. They tied him to a pillory in the town square and smashed his own supply of rancid butter onto his head. He had to sit there in the baking sun while the greasy, smelly mess melted and dripped down his face and clothes. It was the ultimate return-to-sender policy. The neighbors would gather around to laugh at the human candle, proving that the best way to teach fair trade is to make sure the scammer smells like expired dairy for the next 3 weeks. 23. The Ottoman Empire had a unique way of dealing with high-ranking officials who messed up, and it sounds like a reality TV show finale. It was a literal foot race for your life. If a grand vizier was sentenced to death, he could challenge the head gardener, who doubled as the executioner, to a sprint through the palace gardens. If the official reached the fish house gate at the end of the garden before the gardener caught him, his sentence was commuted to mere exile. Imagine the prime minister sprinting through the bushes in silk robes, trying to outrun the guy who usually trims the roses, just to avoid getting strangled. It brings a whole new level of intensity to cardio day. 24. Gym memberships are painful enough, but Victorian Britain invented a workout machine solely to punish prisoners, known as the treadmill or the everlasting staircase. Convicts were forced to walk on a giant wide wheel with steps for up to 6 hours a day. The catch? The wheel didn't power anything. It didn't grind grain or pump water. It just spun air. The entire point was to make men grind their own souls into dust through sheer, pointless exhaustion. It was the ancestor of the modern Stairmaster, but with zero upbeat music and terrible food, designed specifically to break your spirit by making you realize your effort literally meant nothing. 25. Spartan parenting was legendary for being tough, but their stance on theft was confusing enough to give anyone a headache. Young Spartan boys were actually encouraged to steal food to supplement their meager diets and learn stealth. However, if they were caught, they were brutally whipped. The punishment wasn't for the crime of stealing. It was for the crime of being bad at it. The lesson wasn't, stealing is wrong. It was, don't get caught, you amateur. It's the ancient equivalent of a parent telling you that you can take the car, but if you scratch it, you are grounded forever. It created a generation of highly skilled paranoid kleptomaniacs. 26. In 17th century Scotland, if you were caught doing something immoral like dancing, swearing, or working on a Sunday, the church turned you into a classroom spectacle. You were forced to sit on the cuddy stool, a tall, wobbly chair placed conspicuously in front of the entire congregation. You had to sit there for the entire service while the minister lectured everyone on how awful you were. Sometimes you had to wear a coarse sackcloth gown just to really sell the "I am a sinner" look. It was basically an adult timeout chair, weaponizing social awkwardness to ensure you never had fun on a weekend ever again. 27. Fighting with your roommate is annoying, but in medieval Europe, they had a device called the shrew's fiddle, or the neck violin, to force people to get along. It was a wooden board shaped like a double violin with holes for 2 necks and 4 wrists. If 2 women were caught quarreling in public, they were locked into this device facing each other. They were physically stuck nose to nose, unable to hit each other, forced to stare into their enemy's eyes while walking through town. It was the get-along shirt, but made of heavy timber. You either worked out your differences or you just awkwardly breathed on each other until the magistrate let you go. 28. Russia's Peter the Great wanted his country to look modern and European, so he decided that beards were the enemy of progress. He didn't make having a beard a crime, but he made it incredibly expensive by introducing a beard tax. If you wanted to keep your facial hair, you had to pay a hefty fine and carry a special copper beard token in your pocket at all times. This coin literally had a picture of a beard on it, and the words, "The beard is a useless burden." Police could stop you on the street, and if you had a beard but no token, they would shave you on the spot. It was a government-mandated bullying campaign against hipsters. 29. Selling bad food is a health hazard, but in 14th century London, selling bad fish was a ticket to becoming a walking accessory. If a fishmonger was caught selling product that was past its prime, the punishment was to be paraded through the city with a necklace made of the stinking, rotten fish slung over his shoulders. He had to walk through the crowded market while the slime dripped onto his tunic, and the smell announced his arrival from 3 blocks away. It was a brilliant marketing strategy in reverse. The authorities made sure every single potential customer associated your face with the smell of death and decay. 30. We all wish real life had cheat codes, but in medieval England, criminals actually had one, and it was called benefit of clergy. The law stated that members of the clergy could only be tried by church courts, which were notoriously lenient and didn't hand out the death penalty. But here is the loophole. The only way they tested if you were a priest was by checking if you could read. So, illiterate career criminals would memorize exactly one specific Bible verse, Psalm 51, and recite it perfectly in court. It became known as the neck verse because it literally saved your neck. You could rob a house, get caught, recite a few lines of Latin you didn't understand, and the judge would have to sigh, mark you down as a monk, and let you off with a slap on the wrist. It was a legal glitch that everyone knew about, but nobody fixed for centuries. 31. Fashion police are a metaphor today, but in the Middle Ages they were a very real and annoying government agency enforcing sumptuary laws. The king was terrified that the peasants might start looking too cool, so he passed strict laws regulating exactly how pointy your shoes could be. During the trend of poulains, those long, ridiculous pointy shoes, the law stated that only nobility could have points longer than 2 feet. Police would literally stand on street corners with rulers, measuring people's feet. If your shoe tip was 2 inches over the legal limit, they would chop the end of your shoe off and fine you for having excessive drip. It was a desperate attempt by the elite to gatekeep swag, proving that insecure rulers will outlaw anything if it makes them feel less special. 32. Modern divorce courts are messy, but medieval Germany settled marital disputes with a literal gladiator match known as divorce by combat. The judges would set up a ring, but to make it fair, they gave the husband a bizarre handicap. The man had to stand inside a waist-deep hole in the ground, armed with a wooden club, while the woman could move freely around the edge of the pit, armed with a rock tied into a piece of clothing like a heavy flail. They would just swing at each other until one gave up. It was an official, state-sanctioned domestic dispute resolved by whacking your spouse with a rock and a sock. It's absolutely wild to think that a judge looked at a crumbling marriage and thought, "You know what this relationship needs? A pit and some blunt force trauma." 33. We use the word eavesdropper all the time, but in Anglo-Saxon law, it was a literal crime with a very specific definition. An eavesdropper was a person who stood under the eaves, the overhanging edge of a roof, to listen to the private conversations happening inside the house. The punishment was usually a heavy fine or public shaming, but the act itself was its own punishment. To commit this crime, you had to stand right where the rain dripped off the roof, meaning you were getting soaking wet just to hear if your neighbors were arguing about their goats. The law was basically designed to punish the neighborhood busybody for standing in the splash zone, turning gossip into a wet, miserable, and illegal activity. 34. If you were a mischievous child in the ancient Mayan civilization, getting grounded wasn't an option. Instead, you faced chemical warfare. Mayan parents had a unique disciplinary method where they would hold a misbehaving child over a fire that was burning hot chili peppers. The smoke from the chilies was incredibly acrid and would cause the eyes and throat to sting and burn intensely, like a primitive form of tear gas. It didn't cause permanent damage, but it was absolutely terrifying and uncomfortable. It was the ultimate scared straight tactic. You definitely stopped pulling your sister's hair after your parents fumigated you like a termite mound. It gives a whole new spicy meaning to the phrase hot-tempered. 35. In medieval England, nobody wanted to be responsible for their own actions, so the government invented the Frank Pledge system, which was basically a forced group project for adults. Every man over the age of 12 was assigned to a group of 10 neighbors called a tithing. If one person in your group committed a crime and ran away, the other 9 were legally responsible for paying his fines and taking his punishment. Imagine if your neighbor stole a horse, and the police came to your house to arrest you just because you live next door. It turned every village into a surveillance state where everyone was obsessively watching their neighbors, not out of care, but out of fear that Dave's bad choices were going to bankrupt the whole block. 36. The ducking stool is famous for punishing scolds, but it was originally a quality control measure for bad beer. In a time when beer was safer to drink than water, brewing was serious business, often run by women known as alewives. If an alewife was caught selling watered-down or spoiled beer, the magistrate would strap her into a chair attached to a seesaw mechanism and dunk her into the local river, or worse, into a vat of her own bad brew. It was a wet, humiliating way to tell a business owner that her product was trash. The message was simple: if you are going to sell garbage liquid to the community, you are going to marinate in it until you learn to follow the recipe. 37. Being a bad student in the 19th century meant you had to wear the dunce cap, but the origin of this punishment is ironically tragic. The hat is named after John Duns Scotus, a medieval philosopher who believed that wearing a conical hat acted as a funnel for knowledge to flow into the brain. He was actually a genius of his time. But later scholars hated his theories so much that they turned his thinking cap into a symbol of idiocy. Teachers would force slow learners to stand in the corner wearing this dunce hat to mock them. It's the ultimate historical burn. A brilliant man's legacy was twisted so badly that his name literally became the synonym for stupid person for hundreds of years. 38. We have all gotten mad at inanimate objects when they don't work, but King Xerxes of Persia took this to a global superpower level. When a storm destroyed his pontoon bridges across the Hellespont Strait during his invasion of Greece, he didn't just rebuild them, he put the ocean on trial for treason. Xerxes ordered his soldiers to whip the sea 300 times with chains and shout insults at the water. He even threw a pair of shackles into the depths to symbolically arrest the ocean. It was the ultimate temper tantrum by a man who was so used to getting his way that he genuinely thought he could bully a body of water into submission through physical violence and bad vibes. 39. In medieval Europe, if you were accused of a crime, you didn't necessarily need evidence or a good lawyer, you just needed a squad of loyal friends. This was called trial by oath or compurgation. The court would allow you to walk free if you could find 12 people willing to stand up and swear on a Bible that you were a totally cool guy who would never steal a pig. It didn't matter if you actually did it. It only mattered if you were popular enough to convince a dozen neighbors to risk their souls for you. It was essentially a justice system based entirely on clout, turning the courtroom into a popularity contest where having a big social circle was a get-out-of-jail-free card. 40. Ancient Mesopotamia treated property crimes with a level of creativity that feels like the world's first customer service chaos. If you stole someone's boat, grain, or even tools, the court might order the punishment called river ordeal. You were forced to jump into the Euphrates, and let the river decide your guilt. If you survived the violent current, the gods had cleared your name. If you didn't, well, the case was officially closed. It was justice by hydraulic force, proving that for the Babylonians, due process involved equal parts theology and aggressive swimming lessons. 41. Politics can be annoying, but in ancient Athens, the lawmaker Solon decided that not caring about politics was a capital offense. He passed a law stating that if a civil war or riot broke out in the city, any citizen who remained neutral and refused to pick a side would be stripped of their citizenship and exiled. You were legally required to join the fight and start yelling at people. Solon believed that if good men stayed home and watched the chaos from their windows, the city would be ruined. So, he essentially outlawed mind your own business, forcing every introvert in Athens to grab a spear and get involved in the drama whether they wanted to or not. 42. The Hittites of Anatolia enforced honesty with a punishment that sounds like a bureaucrat's fever dream: the substitute head. If a craftsman produced a defective tool, weapon, or piece of equipment, the court forced him to pay damages by literally supplying a new head, made of clay or metal, to replace the useless head he supposedly had. This symbolic decapitation was placed on his doorstep as a public reminder that he had lost his head over shoddy work. It was passive-aggressive quality control, ancient world edition, where the state basically told you, your brain was defective, we've issued a new one. 43. The ancient Egyptians believed that writing carried real power, so they punished thieves and troublemakers with execration rituals, the ultimate spiritual complaint form. A victim would inscribe the offender's name on a pottery shard or small clay figurine, then smash, burn, or bury it during a ceremony asking the gods to ruin the culprit's luck, business, and social reputation. No gore, no demons, just pure cosmic pettiness. It was basically the oldest known version of leaving a furious one-star review, except instead of customer service responding, the universe supposedly handled it. 44. Finally, the ultimate cheat code for criminals in the Middle Ages was the concept of sanctuary. If you were being chased by the authorities for almost any crime, you just had to run faster than them and touch the door handle of a church. Once you were on holy ground, the police couldn't touch you. It was like playing a game of tag where the church was base. You could stay inside for 40 days, fed by the priests, while the sheriff just had to stand outside and wait. Eventually, you had to confess and leave the country, but for over a month, you could just hang out in safety solely because you won a foot race to the cathedral door. History never ran out of imagination. Some civilizations used it a little too enthusiastically. Now I want your judgment. Which punishment from this list do you secretly think would fix a few modern problems? Be honest, go chaotic, and name it in the comments. And if you want more history that hits this hard, hit subscribe and drop a like. It tells me to make the next one even wilder.